Hi everybody. So to start this off, I'd like you to take a couple of minutes, pause the video, and I want you to think about creating at least 3 different sketches to visualize these two quantities, 42 and 23. Think about how you could visualize these. How could you graph these or symbolize them somehow? It's a real challenge. Pause the video. Turn it on after 5 minutes. Okay, so these might be some of the solutions that you came up with. Heights, positions, creating parts of a whole, graphic symbols. The idea is that we're simplifying something that's inherently more complex. Signals, signs, these things are meant to quickly convey information, efficient messaging. Take a close look at this clever little set of glyphs. Each one of them is made from a single line. As an artist, I'm rather hypnotized by the elegance of these things. I mean, how can so much information be conveyed with one simple line? I mean, there can't be any question about what any of these are, right? There's movement, these are incredible to me. And Picasso, just so you know, also experimented with this idea of paring objects down to their 2-dimensional minimum. How far can you distill a complex image before you lose the essence of what it is? Just something to ponder. But that's kind of what we're thinking about, I think, here when we're trying to symbolize complex abstract concepts with points, lines, and polygons, really. Okay, so back to the 2 quantities you symbolized at the beginning. Here are 45 other ways to communicate 2 quantities. You'll see everything here from area comparisons, dot densities, geographic coordinates, representative color, hues or shades, angles, just to inspire you to keep pushing boundaries and think outside the box. Not everything has to be a bar chart or a scatter plot. Okay, encoding. In this series of slides, we're going to discuss the idea of encoding. Representing values graphically with points, lines, and areas. And we're going to cover some of the language associated with encoding. Okay, starting with Jacques Breton, a French cartographer who's credited with being the first person to recognize and describe the basic vocabulary of vision. Visual language is a system of signs. Images are perceived as a set of signs. The sender encodes information in signs, and then the receiver decodes information from signs. He wrote this monumental book, The Semiology of Graphics. It was the first to provide a theoretical foundation to information visualization. And again, what is information visualization? It's the understanding of how visually representing abstract data can reinforce or strengthen human cognition, making it easier, more efficient, more effective to visualize. Okay, so Breton created a library and a vocabulary to describe attributes of visual perception that we use to display otherwise very abstract data. And I'm going to break that down for you. And here they are. Remember earlier we described visualizations as having grammar and vocabulary? Cairo called it scaffolding, if you remember. The way we choose to represent abstractions like numbers is called encoding. If visualizations have a grammar, the visual marks that we use are the building blocks, nouns, verbs, and adjectives. And there are rules for how we put them together. Remember that water quality plot that we made fun of earlier where the independent variable of time was treated like a dependent variable? That broke the grammatical rules of visualization. It would be like saying the sentence, swim is Georging, instead of George is swimming. I mean, it's just silly and we don't do that. But that's the same way when we mistreat a dependent variable or independent variable. We're just breaking basic rules of encoding. So don't let this become overcomplicated in your head. You intuitively already know most of this. It's all stuff that intuitively you know, but we're going to break it down to help show the nuances and be able to discuss some of the best practices and also be on the same page with the terminology. Okay, so the marks we talk about when encoding data are the same as you're used to working with in GIS: points, lines, and areas. And these represent the observations or the data points. And they're the basic graphical elements in a chart or map, and they represent the information or values. Okay? The way the marks are drawn, Bertin labeled as channels. We can control the way the marks look to encode additional layers of information, more complex information into the marks. We can change a line's location, like position along a scale. We can change the size or the color or the texture to add meaning and differentiate it from other marks. And like I said, you already know this. We're just giving things names. So we've got points, lines, and areas. These are the basic graphical elements in an image. And then the perceptual channels are things like position, size, value, texture, color, etc. Okay, we can combine marks and channels into a whole variety of visuals. Bar charts are encoding information using position, either vertical or horizontal, depending on how you have your axes set up. The mark here is a line. Scatter plots encode by position along two different scales. The mark is a point. And we can increase the complexity by encoding a third variable, by changing the color of the marks on a scatter plot. The marks are still points, the channels are position and color. And then we could add a fourth variable by encoding with a new channel of size. The mark is still a point, but now we've complicated and increased our complexity by adding color. Don't be off-put by the term encoding. We're basically translating the data into a visual picture or element. Sophie Warnes, she's a data viz blogger, describes the rule-ish nature of what we're trying to do like this. Every time the data changes in some way, do this visual thing to it. So first, how do we decide what mark to use? Look at this really boring plot showing how populations of bears, dolphins, and whales changes over time. We're encoding population size with position along the y-axis. We're encoding animal type with color, and we're encoding time with position along the x-axis. We could use her rule format to describe the animal type element like this. Every time category changes from bears to dolphins to whales, change the color of the bar from blue to orange to gray. Or, every time the population value goes up, increase the bar height. You might say, this is so dumb. Of course the bar gets bigger if the population number gets bigger. But some people don't respect these intuitive conventions, either because they aren't paying attention or they have some ulterior agenda and want to alter your perception of the data. So not only are we going to talk about it so that we can know that these things are just theory and they've been studied and there are ways to think about it, there are rules, but yeah, it is really important because some people will break these on purpose. Okay. This is one of those graphic visualizations that I was showing you about Hamilton. It's very simple and complex at the same time. The clusters represent sets of lines with natural breaks or between songs. The colors represent the person that's speaking or singing. Aaron Burr's in purple, for example. Alexander Hamilton's in green, Thomas Jefferson's in orange, the company's in yellow. The size of the circle reflects the length of the lyric before there's a break. And there's a link to I put a link to this graphic on the Canvas page. So anyway, every single time a speaker change the color. When the length of the lyric increases, make the area bigger, ... That's how to think about this. All right, so let's practice. Here's a scatter plot. What kind of mark is it? You have three choices. It's either a point, a line, or an area, polygon. So the mark is a point. The channel, how are we encoding? Like, how are we changing the values? Well, we're using position along a scale, horizontal or vertical. What do we know from the pattern? What can we deduce from this? We know that the 3 points are distinguishable, that B falls between A and C, and that the arc from B to C is twice as long as the arc from A to B. We know things like that. That's called the analytical pattern. You know, how are we reading? What can we know from this data by looking at it like this? Okay, now we have language to talk about the different marks and channels, or how we encode or assign visuals to data. But now we're going to talk about how effectively people can decode these marks. The analytical patterns in the last slide are deducted from decoding the marks. When we decode, we're performing perceptual tasks, little jobs of seeing, comparing, evaluating. So in 1984, Cleveland and McGill published their research results on detection accuracy using a basic set of perceptual tasks. Okay, let's look at these. These are the basic visual building blocks for comparing quantities. The plots that we're most familiar with are the ones we're going to talk about. So marks and channels and how accurately people can decode them. Position along common scale, angle. When we're looking at pie charts, we're comparing angles, the areas, the arc length, position along a common scale, length, shading, position along a common or a non-aligned scales. These are all the perceptual tasks that Cleveland and McGill tested for accuracy. Okay, let's get into the weeds a little bit. We're going to look at one perceptual task, excuse me, in more detail, position along a common scale. So Cleveland and McGill looked at 5 types of decoding that we typically have to do when comparing different positions against common scale. What we're comparing in each of these are the 2 segments marked with the dot. Sometimes they're kind of hard to see. The question that participants were asked in their study is how much bigger is one than the other. So people were asked to estimate how much bigger is this segment from this segment, or how much bigger is this segment from this segment. So type 1 is this situation where the 2 heights are right next to each other and they share a baseline. This is the easiest and most accurate comparison, which should come at no surprise. Type 2 is the same, but there's a little space between the marks. Note that the comparison people were asked to make was only for the 2 heights marked with a little dot again. Okay, type 3. This is where the baseline is shared, but there are distracting things between the 2 marks that we're supposed to be comparing. Type 4 introduces the inconsistent baseline. A visual shift is easier because there's nothing between them. And then here, type 5, how much bigger is this one than the other? So these are the 5 comparisons that people were asked to make. Okay, groups 1, 2, and 3, the task is to compare position using a common baseline or a common scale. In types 4 and 5, you're forced to compare areas or lengths of the side of the segment, and it turns out this is a lot harder for humans to do accurately. Okay, so again, how much bigger is one than the other? The amount of error in all the responses was averaged, and that's what's plotted up here with the standard deviation for each plot type. So type 1, type 2, type 3 here's a reminder. Type 1 is common baseline. They're right next to each other. Type 2 and type 3. Type 1 has the lowest average error when comparing the two heights. Types 2 and 3, position along a shared baseline with a little space and with distractors, have a very similar error, with it just being a little bit harder to get an accurate read if there are distracting elements between them, as there are in type 3. So this is increasing error on the x-axis. The biggest jump in error is when we lose the consistent baseline and shift to having to read lengths and areas instead of position along the common scale. So when we're forced to compare these two areas or the lengths of the sides, that's where we get this big jump in error. I was actually kind of surprised that there was this big of a jump in the error just by putting a space in between these. And I also wonder if it's because the distance from, even though there's nothing to mark against over here, the distance is also greater from the y-axis. Anyway, so when the lengths or the areas are stacked, that's when the most error occurs, or it's harder to get an accurate read of, the actual values associated with these segments. Okay, for a little bonus, here's how pie charts and bar charts stand up in the effectiveness rankings. Pie charts are decoded using angle, arc length, and even the area of each of the pie slices to some extent. Bar charts, like we just discussed, are compared using position along a common scale. But when set up side by side, the bar chart performed very well, and the accuracy of the pie chart was a little better than length. So if you look at it here, type 1 is position along the scale, and then angle is the pie chart. So that falls right in here. So it did a little bit better, actually quite a bit better, than having to compare the lengths like this, which I think is pretty interesting. But I wonder if it isn't because you can add all three of those things together. You're not just comparing angle, you're also comparing area and arc length. So you kind of have three things working for you in this case, which I think helps give you maybe a better error reading. But anyway, some food for thought. Okay, so you're going to see this type of ranking or like a visualization of their results, which is what this is, in many different forms. I have stumbled upon it 100 times since I started teaching this class. The graphic shows the effectiveness ranking, and the message is always the same. This is the least accurate for extracting, exact amounts, and these are the best for extracting exact amounts. If your chart's message requires the viewer to take an accurate value away from it, you need to stick with these kinds of encoding. Position along a common scale, position on unaligned scales. Lengths, these are the best. They're the most effective ways to encode data to allow for accurate visual comparisons. It doesn't mean that these other types, though, are bad or that inaccuracy is bad. It just might not be the point of the visualization. Sometimes these work better for what we're trying to do. All right, let's look at an example in Tableau. All right, we're going to look at a set of data for a fictional coffee shop. The measures include sales and profit. Those are our quantities. They're continuous numeric data. So, in other words, measures in the Tableau lingo. Market is nominal data. So it's going to be treated as a dimension. I'm talking about like north, south, east, west markets. Okay, so you don't have to track this, but you've worked with Tableau enough to get how this works. But sales, so that's one of our quantities or measures is on the x-axis and profit is on the y. So we've created a scatter plot like you guys have done in class. There's clearly a relationship where profit increases with increased sales, right? We see that positive relationship. This cluster that peels off at the top might be worth inspecting. So we might experiment with encoding using other channels like shape or color. So we can see here what we've done is encoded the market with color. And now we can see that there is a consistency, that this is all the same market. So we might ask what this, what this blue market, oh, this isn't quite right. This is saying product type is coffee. Sorry about that. Oh, shape, sorry, I totally lied. Shape is the market and the product type is coffee. So something is going on with coffee in the East market that's different than what's going on with the rest of the company. And then we could also actually ask what's going on in the West with tea, because it's in its own little group down here. Yeah, sorry for that confusion. Okay, so this is the same. Oh no, now we're doing all sorts of things. So now we've got the product type and the market, and size is encoding how much they're spending on marketing. So now we've really got a problem, because all that money that's being spent on tea down in the South really isn't paying off for profits. And coffee is selling itself up here. Yeah, so a whole lot of stuff going on. Sales, profit, the product type, the market or geographic location, and how much is being spent on marketing. 5 different variables going on in one plot, and fairly easy to read. So I want to talk about something called the effectiveness principle. Be effective in choosing the channels for your data. Encode the most important attributes with the channels that are the easiest for humans to perceive, right? We know that shape is not very effective. I noticed the color right away and kind of jumped to the conclusion that was the market, because in my brain, that's what I wanted to see first. So if you want your audience to take away a message about the markets, make sure that you're using color to encode after the position, because that's going to be the easiest thing for people to pick up on. The shape, you have to work a lot harder to differentiate the shape. And then with the marketing and the different sizes, you're going to need to be really careful, because as you've already learned, working with this stuff in Tableau, it is really hard to differentiate the differences between the different sizes. So all you're really going to get is kind of a big picture trend. You're not going to be able to discern, I think, differences between points. And look at, they're dealing with the exact same thing here that you guys were struggling with, the difference in sizes here. Anyway, okay. So that's the effectiveness principle. Make sure that you are encoding the things that are most important with the things that are easiest for people to decode. Now, don't get this confused with the effectiveness rankings as far as color being less effective at being able to discern exact values. That's not what we're trying to do here. We're not trying to extract exact values from this plot. It is easier for people to see color in a pattern like this than it is to discern the different shapes. But shapes, that's different than position along a common scale. Okay, let's move on here. Whoops. Yeah, okay. So maybe market is really important, and so another way you could try encoding that is to break it up into something called small multiples or facets. This is called a facet plot, where we're using the same set of variables, but instead of trying to add the market in with the sizes, which made things a little bit wonky to look at, we're just pulling it out and making it in 4 plots so that we can compare the 4 markets side by side. We'll be talking about that some more. Okay, visual variables. This is a handy way to describe how we assign symbology to data. Marks are points, lines, and areas. Channels are things like position, size, shape, value, color, orientation. And we can assign marks depending on the type of data, and assign and vary channels depending on what we want to stand out the most and how accurately and quickly we want our viewer to notice and decode the symbols. Here's a list too of some of the advancements that have been made in addition to Bertin's visual variables, things like the saturation of color, arrangement, which could get back to the Gestalt principles like groupings, crispness, fuzzy borders versus sharp focus, resolution, transparency. Okay, visual variables are the differences in map elements as perceived by the human eye. And it's not just map elements, it's graphics and plots too. So no matter the type of map or graphic, these are the fundamental ways in which symbols can be distinguished. That's what we mean by visual variables. There's three basic types: selective, non-selective, ordered and unordered, and quantitative. So really briefly, selective variables. This means it's easy to identify and isolate groups based on the way the symbol is drawn. And that's what I meant by color. When we look at a scatter plot, color is very easy to perceive them into groups. We definitely identify the yellow as belonging to other yellows, more than their relationship to each other on the X or Y. So color is a selective variable. Shape is not, and this is kind of what we were getting at with those plots. It was much harder, it was a lot more work to notice the difference between a triangle and a square and a circle. So shape is a non-selective variable. It's going to be more work. So for effectiveness, we want to make sure the more important thing is encoded with color, and then things further down in the hierarchy of importance are given differences in shape. Ordered variables. So this is really important when we're thinking about things like sequential color ramps. Ordered variables have an immediate recognizable sequence. If you can see that there's a rank or organization of the symbols, then it's an ordered variable. So size and value are ordered. When we look at this set of different size circles, we can imagine that they represent a graduation in some numeric variable. And same here, the change in shade or value implies that it's representing some kind of continuous variable. Okay, color by itself is not. Shades of color, tints of color are, but color is not. You can't know if red is more or less than blue, right? Okay, so what does this mean for maps and charts? When encoding numeric data, which most of the time has some order, you want to employ ordered visual variables in your symbolization. So be careful not to use things like divergent color ramps that might go from red to neutral to blue, because you don't know if blue is more or less than red, but you could go from white to dark blue. Does that make sense? Okay, sequential color schemes, not multi-hued color schemes like the prism. And on the other side, avoid ordered variables for things that have no natural order. So don't use a color ramp like this that's a sequential color ramp that goes from light to dark to symbolize things like species or geographic regions or ancestry groups from census data, because there is no order there. There's no implied rank. Okay, and then finally, quantitative variables. These allow for an estimation of the actual numerical difference between symbols, but it's tough, so be careful. Position on a bar chart, that works pretty well. We've talked about that. That's a very effective way for humans to be able to estimate an actual numerical difference between symbols. Size is not so easy. I wrote here, fairly easy to see that the left circle is half the size of the right circle. Well, fairly easy. I should put that in quotes. It's really not that easy, and we've talked about perception differences and how humans tend to misrepresent areas of circles like this. But we can discern that this is bigger, and it is probably close to twice as big. Value lightness is the lowest on the scale for how easy it is to estimate. It's almost impossible for someone to be able to say that this is twice as dark as this one. So it would be very difficult to discern actual numerical differences between symbols when you're using shade. So a quantitative variable stick with position. And when we are on a map, sizes are going to be easier than shades of one color, unless you can start getting into graduating from yellow to red. We still don't know if red is more than yellow, but using annotations and titles and a legend, it's going to help infer that. Okay, wrapping up. Visual variables in cartography and data visualization. Understanding how visual variables work lets you leverage our natural ability to perceive order. And the way you choose to symbolize your data will imply, correctly or incorrectly, patterns, groups, order, and quantities.